It's the invisible water debt building beneath the American West, a slow-motion collapse that could cripple the Western power grid, drain reservoirs, and leave millions scrambling in the next decade. It's a crisis nobody is paying attention to. So we dug through park records, internal reports, and the research behind Glacier National Park's infamous Gone by 2020 signs. When the signs came down, headlines framed it as proof the glaciers were recovering. They weren't. The original 2003 model had failed, and the correction revealed something far more dangerous for every town downstream. The scientists went back in 2010 to check the data. What they found changed the entire story. The ice was destabilizing faster than anyone expected. Sperry Glacier sits high inside Glacier National Park and is one of the most heavily monitored ice masses in the lower 48. Since 2013, the U.S. Geology Survey has tracked it year after year through its Benchmark Glacier program, and every measurement points in the same direction. The glacier is losing mass. Snowfall is no longer replacing what summer melt takes away. The ice is thinning in real time. Sperry is now the bellwether for everything else in the park, and the numbers paint a pretty grim picture. In 1850, the region that became Glacier National Park held roughly 150 glaciers. When the park opened in 1910, most of them were still thriving. By 2015, only 26 were large enough to even qualify as glaciers anymore. The streams that those glaciers used to feed are already feeling the effects. They run warmer and lower. They peak weeks earlier than they used to. On the St. Mary side of the park, bull trout, fish that only survive in near-freezing water, are now listed as a threatened species. And the damage doesn't stop inside the park boundaries either. Farmers downstream are starting to notice reduced water levels arriving at the wrong season, year after year. The temperature records explain why this is happening. Since 1900, Glacier National Park has warmed by roughly 1.3 degrees Celsius, that's 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit, as much as 80% faster than the global average. Snowpack melts at least 2 weeks earlier now than it did when the original glacier models were built. The mountains are changing shape. Tree lines are moving higher, spreading into alpine meadows that used to be too cold to support them. Even the shaded valleys that once protected the park's largest ice fields are heating up. Those pockets of cold air bought the glaciers time, but that protection had a limit, and that limit is disappearing. The park itself doesn't want to talk about it, and there's reasons for that. Visitor numbers regularly hit close to 3 million per year. Glossy brochures still feature the glaciers and snow-capped mountains. Rangers still point out Grinnell Glacier from the same trail people walked 50 years ago. But the lookout points have crept closer to where the ice used to be. Scientists studying the park are far less optimistic. Dan Fager, the USGS researcher who led the original modeling for the park, has spent years warning that the trend is moving in one direction. He's described many of the park's remaining glaciers as little more than small lumps of ice on the landscape. Because the real concern was never whether the old prediction was missed by a few years, it's what happens when the last stable ice reserves in the Rockies stop functioning altogether. A glacier is not just frozen water sitting on a mountain. It's more like a machine. It catches winter snow, holds it through spring, and then releases water slowly across the hottest, driest months. That timing is crucial. Once the ice gets too thin, the system stops working. Snow still falls and it still melts, but now it melts early, in May instead of August, and surges downstream all at once. The total water volume can look the same, but the timing of it all has collapsed. And in the American West, timing is everything. That has already happened to many of the smaller ice bodies in the park. They still appear on satellite photos, but they don't behave like glaciers. To the USGS, they're stagnant, and even though they might look the same, they work in different ways now. The first cracks show up where the water system is weakest, and one notable example happened just outside Babb, Montana. And no one wants to talk about it because it exposed how fragile the entire system really is. On June 17, 2024, the St. Mary Canal siphon blew apart. The first breach hit at 8:45 in the morning. By afternoon, both siphon barrels had failed completely. The washout was 30 to 50 feet deep. The canal was carrying 600 cubic feet per second when it gave out. Bureau of Reclamation crews already knew one of the barrels was cracking. They were monitoring it and hoping it would survive the season. It didn't. Replacing the siphons will cost roughly $70 million. Congress approved an emergency stopgap package, and the state of Montana added another $26 million. By late June of 2025, water was flowing again ahead of schedule. Look at what feeds off that one pipe. The St. Mary's system delivers roughly 70% of the Milk River flow in an average year, and up to 100% during dry years. It also serves drinking water to 18,000 Montanans and irrigates more than 140,000 acres of cropland. That's like watering 106,000 football fields. The Blackfeet Nation depends on it. Fort Belknap depends on it too, along with 8 separate irrigation districts spread across the region. So when the siphon failed, it wasn't a partial disruption, it was a system-wide shutdown. For an entire growing season, the water stopped moving through a network that everything downstream had been built around. The diversion dam is still being rebuilt, with construction stretching into 2028. Downstream, the Halls Coulee siphon is already scheduled for replacement after engineers flagged it as the next likely failure point. They might have fixed the pipes, but they did not fix the problem. All it does is replace aging links in a chain that's still being stressed the same way, and it doesn't address the problem of the source water declining. Because the problem is not downstream infrastructure, it's the upstream supply. It's the source system that everything else depends on. And that source sits inside a national park still treated in public imagination like a scenic destination instead of a failing water engine. The ice will hang on in some form for decades. So why are tribal nations and farm districts already fighting for emergency money? Why are they patching pipes built when Woodrow Wilson was in the White House? You might think this is a Montana problem, but it isn't. There is a peak inside the park called Triple Divide. Drop a snowflake on top of it. Depending on which side of the rock it lands on, that snowflake ends up in 3 different oceans. Water heading west goes into the Flathead and eventually reaches the Pacific. Head east and you reach the Missouri River, the Mississippi, and then the Gulf of Mexico. Head north and the St. Mary River carries the water across into Canada and all the way to the Arctic. 1 summit, 3 oceans. That means the ice in this park is not just supplying Montana. It's feeding the Pacific Northwest grid, the High Plains wheat country, and rivers that cross an international border. A combined economy worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The Flathead side matters most for power. 3 forks feed it. The North Fork traces the western edge of Glacier National Park. The Middle Fork runs along the southern boundary. Both pull meltwater directly from the park's ice fields before merging downstream into the main stem of the Flathead River. The South Fork comes in from the Bob Marshall Wilderness, south of the park, adding volume from a broader snowpack system. Everything converges into Hungry Horse Reservoir, just 15 miles from the park's western entrance. From there, water becomes power. Hungry Horse Dam feeds a grid that includes 31 federal hydro facilities across the Pacific Northwest. At the top of that system sits Grand Coulee Dam, the backbone of regional production. But Hungry Horse doesn't run flat. It runs on peaking schedules. It ramps up when demand spikes in the hottest months of the year, late July, August, and early September. Those are exactly the weeks when glacier-fed runoff used to do the stabilizing work in the background. Now, that timing is shifting. The east side is different, but just as critical. Those flows feed wheat, barley, and sugar beet farms across the northern Great Plains. Some of that grain moves into Canadian markets. The 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty still controls how the St. Mary and Milk Rivers get split between the 2 countries. That whole treaty assumes the flows are roughly stable. They're not. When this one peak stops working at full strength, the damage doesn't stay in one state. It doesn't even stay in one country. And there is another layer to this that almost never gets mentioned. The Bonneville Power Administration, the BPA, sells electricity across 8 western states. It pulls power from a hydropower system built on the assumption that river flow is stable and predictable. Its rates are structured around expected output. When that output falls short, BPA either buys replacement power on the open market or passes the shortfalls straight through to utilities. Either way, the cost lands on household bills. At the same time, the region has been attracting the fastest growing electricity demand in North America. Large-scale data centers, including facilities operated by Microsoft and Google, were built here for one simple reason: cheap, reliable hydropower from the Columbia River system. Now, they're scaling up for artificial intelligence workloads that require even more electricity. At the same time, the system feeding them is becoming less predictable. All of it connects back to the same basin. The same upstream snow and ice feeding the Columbia network, including the meltwater that once buffered late summer demand. Demand is accelerating while the infrastructure is aging. The source water that stabilizes the entire system is steadily declining. This is where the story stops being about ice and starts being about something much harder to fix. When the St. Mary siphon failed on June 17, 2024, the water stopped moving, but the water rights weren't suspended. No contracts were voided. The system worked perfectly on paper while the river did not. That gap between the legal record and the physical reality is the most dangerous part, and almost no one is talking about it. The rule that produces that gap is called prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. The earliest claims get priority access to water, enforced through court records and administrative rulings dating back to the 1900s. And even today, they're still treated as legally binding. Imagine two ranchers on the same stretch of the St. Mary River in northern Montana. One family filed a water claim in 1908. The other arrived in 1962. In a dry year, when the river drops below the levels that they both need, the 1908 family receives their full allocation. The 1962 family receives nothing. Not a reduced amount, nothing at all. The system was designed to protect certainty for early users, and it works, but it overlooked one thing. It wasn't designed for a river that keeps shrinking year after year. These rights were written when summer flow was consistent and glacier melt provided a reliable seasonal buffer. It was always believed the buffer would continue indefinitely. Well, it hasn't. The ice that used to stabilize these rivers no longer behaves like a storage system, and when the physical system doesn't match the legal paperwork, the consequences are immediate and skewed. Junior users get cut off. Senior users watch it happen from the same riverbank. When shortfalls persist, the system fractures further. Junior users challenge curtailments in water court. Senior users defend their priority. Litigation can run for years, and while the legal process moves at its own pace, the physical supply keeps shrinking underneath it. Montana is not alone in this. Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California all run versions of the same rule. The entire legal map of the American West was built to distribute a resource that was expected to stay the same. The Gravant and Assiniboine tribes at Fort Belknap have spent years negotiating water rights tied to the Milk River. The settlement they're trying to finalize in 2026 is calibrated around flow averages from a period when glacial runoff was artificially boosting the river. The water those averages were based on is already disappearing. The 1908 Winters Doctrine gave federally recognized tribes water rights that come before most state claims. In theory, that makes tribal rights among the most protected in the West. In practice, those rights are only as reliable as the river they were promised against. And that river is changing faster than any settlement can account for. The same gap between allocation and reality that's fracturing Montana is now threatening the largest cross-border water agreement in North American history. The Columbia River Treaty governed flood control and hydroelectric coordination across the US-Canada basin for decades and was widely treated as a model of cross-border stability. Then, in 2025, negotiations suddenly stalled. The treaty that the whole system runs on is now in limbo at exactly the moment the physical system it was written for is becoming unrecognizable. And the timing matters because water treaties don't operate in a vacuum. The Columbia Basin supports a huge share of U.S. hydropower, major agricultural regions, and critical freight routes. Meanwhile, much of the system's upstream control sits inside Canada. The agreement was built around the assumption that the river itself would remain predictable. That assumption is starting to break down. The strange part is that the system still looks healthy from the outside. Reservoirs are near target levels. Major dams are still making releases. In much of the basin, river flow remains close to historical averages. But the appearance of stability is becoming increasingly fragile. The reason it looks healthy is the reason it's in danger. The glacial bonus is still arriving. Ice is melting faster than it's being replaced, and that extra melt is showing up as bonus water in the rivers. The same loss that will cause shortages later is, for the moment, hiding them. There was also a hard deadline buried in the original treaty. In September of 2024, the 60-year assured flood control provisions expired. When they did, the system rolled over into a case-by-case flood management protocol that was never meant to carry the full weight of modern variability. It's a framework built for a different river entirely. Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington has warned that escalating trade tensions could put the entire Columbia River Agreement at risk. Meanwhile, the Bonneville Power Administration has deferred comment to the State Department, and the State Department has remained silent in public for months. What matters isn't how much water is visible in the system right now, it's whether the rules governing it still match the way it behaves when pressure returns. Hydrologists have a name for the turning point: peak water. It's the moment a glacier-fed river reaches its maximum output before it starts declining for good. When a glacier is in balance, it sheds roughly as much water as it gains from snowfall. But as the climate warms, that balance breaks. Ice that took centuries to accumulate begins to melt faster than it can be replaced. And for a period of time, that actually increases river flow. Extra meltwater is added on top of normal seasonal runoff, so the rivers run higher. Reservoirs feel fuller, and the whole system is fueled by a surge that can last for decades. Then, the system crosses a threshold. The glacier shrinks past the point where it can sustain that extra output. The bonus phase ends, and what follows isn't a return to normal. It's a drop to a new baseline, one that's lower and less predictable than anything the infrastructure was designed around. As of 2026, the western US is sitting inside that surge. Some smaller basins have already passed their peak. Larger systems like the Columbia and Missouri are projected to peak somewhere between the 2030s and the 2050s. The exact year depends on the watershed. Reservoir rules, irrigation contracts, hydropower schedules, they're all still based on recent history. That recent history looks like an abundance, but it's inflated by decades of extra meltwater that will not last. An abnormal phase is treated as permanent. Federal agencies understand this. The Bureau of Reclamation has already said in technical language that the old assumption no longer holds. That idea is considered obsolete, but nothing downstream was caught up. Everything is still anchored to those same historical records. Changing them would mean reopening decades of legal and political agreements at once. So instead, the system runs on a contradiction it can't formally acknowledge. The Milk River Project just spent $70 million to replace pipes that fed contracts written under the old rules. The same districts that hold senior rights in 2026 will hold them in 2040, when the water might not be there any longer. One watershed over, the Flathead Irrigation Project is facing a massive infrastructure mismatch. New pumps were installed in the early 2020s, designed for peak flow. But if that surge is already the exception rather than the rule, those systems don't downshift with it. They stay built for a bigger river. BPA is in the same trap. It signs power sale contracts that run for decades. The newest round assumes hydropower output consistent with the past 30 years. Those 30 years include the surge, but the next 30 almost certainly won't. Even small actors are caught. Farm lenders in Montana and northern Idaho have been writing operating loans against cropland values. Those values are baked into current flow conditions. The collateral behind the loans depends on steady water delivery. When the delivery gets cut, the collateral drops in value and loan portfolios drop with it. Regional banks and federal lending programs haven't modeled this as a real risk. So what is supposed to fill the gap when it ends? Agencies running the dams know what is coming. The Bureau of Reclamation's climate strategy openly acknowledges that historical records no longer describe future conditions. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has produced climate-adjusted projections for the Columbia River system. Regional offices have commissioned multiple basin-wide impact studies to understand what a shifting hydrology means for operations on the ground. But none of them have rewritten the operating rules. Why? Because changing the rules threatens ownership. Every senior water right in the West is a piece of paper that only works if the system behind it stays consistent. The moment the baseline shifts officially, those papers become contested. And everyone in the system knows it. So the science moves forward in internal reports and climate scenarios, but the public-facing system doesn't move with it. Decisions will still follow the old framework because changing it would trigger fights no agency wants to be responsible for fighting. That creates a split reality inside the institutions. One version of the river exists in models and forecasts. Another exists in permits and contracts. And the second one is still the one that governs what actually gets built, funded, and delivered. Not because the information is missing, but because acting on it all at once would break too many agreements at once. The Northern Montana Water Security Act is now moving through Congress. It proposes $1.5 billion in more Milk River project funding. The bill addresses aging canals, failing dams, and storage. It doesn't address what those rebuilt structures will deliver. The ice can't act as the late summer buffer it always has. The Army Corps is facing the same problem, just in a different part of the system. It manages flood control across major river basins. It already knows the old flood patterns don't hold like they used to. Thanks to the paperwork, nothing moves. The system keeps going, even while the people running it understand the ground beneath it is shifting. And when the mismatch finally shows up, it won't show up everywhere at once. It'll show up somewhere specific first. Every projection of post-surge flow points the same way. The basins fed by the park's remnant ice will drop. Sometime between the 2030s and the 50s, summer base flow will drop hard, and it won't return. The year might be up for debate, but the direction most certainly is not. None of them include a scenario where that water doesn't come back. Not a single major contract is written for permanent decline. Downstream, the dams themselves were never designed for a permanent drop. Hungry Horse Reservoir was built to handle seasonal swings, not long-term loss of inflow. When water levels fall too far, the system stops behaving like a buffer and starts behaving like a constraint. Turbines lose efficiency and stop producing. And beyond the infrastructure, the pattern repeats in agriculture. Entire regions expanded under the assumption of sustained high flows. Land was converted, debt was taken on, and production scaled to match a water regime that is already fading. None of that adjusts in real time. So when the shift finally shows up, it won't arrive as a system-wide correction. It'll arrive as a series of local failures, farm by farm, district by district. Now they're all elsewhere for water. And it might not be there. There really is no plan B, not at the scale required. The livelihoods of countless ranchers, farmers, tribes, and even the future of the AI economy are built on the Columbia River. They thought the flow was infinite. It's not. It's an expiration date. The Bureau of Reclamation knows what it is. BPA knows what it is. The companies that signed the contracts almost certainly know what it is. None of them have said so publicly. There's no funded storage system big enough to replace the buffer of ice once provided for free. The bills before Congress mostly address aging pipes, not the post-surge yield gap across the basin. There is no international deal that adjusts shares as the physical flow drops, at least not in its current form. And inside reclamation or the core, no rule triggers new construction when the long-term models flash red. The strategies that exist all stay inside the current system. Higher efficiency irrigation, modest reservoir expansions, better forecasting, and demand-side conservation. All of those help around the edges, but none of them replaced the storage that the ice gave away for free. Compared to other regions, what stands out in the northern system isn't just pressure, it's the lack of visible response. In the Southwest, the crisis has been public for years. Nevada has rebuilt its entire conservation model around scarcity. Outdoor water use is tightly restricted. Landscaping has been stripped back block by block. Cities like Las Vegas have turned water reduction into a visible civic project. Across Arizona and California, the response is ongoing. Groundwater limits, mandatory cutbacks, fallowed farmland, and constant public debate about who gets less and when. Even new industries are being forced to justify their demand against a shrinking supply. The problem isn't hidden away for a later date. It's argued over in the open. Parts of California's agriculture sector have already been told to scale it down. In Arizona's expanding suburbs, pumping limits are tightening year by year. Even the emerging lithium extraction efforts in the Southwest reflect the same reality. Water stress is being treated as a defining constraint. But farther north, the signal looks a lot different. In the basins fed by Glacier National Park, the pressure is there, but it's masked by the timing. The surge inflows have made systems look stable even as their foundations weaken. Pipes are still moving water, contracts are still being honored, treaties still read as if nothing fundamental has changed. So, there are no sweeping public conservation campaigns in places like Great Falls, no statewide watering restrictions in Idaho, only small, local limits like tighter controls on new irrigation hookups in parts of the Flathead, rather than a broader public reckoning. The urgency is already there in the data, but on the ground, it feels as if things are normal. The hardest part for affected communities is that the people most exposed have the least say. Wheat farmers in Phillips County did not sign the Columbia River Treaty. Ranchers near Havre did not approve the Hungry Horse contracts. Tribal members on the Blackfeet Reservation did not vote on the Boundary Waters Treaty. They'll be the ones to pay first when the water stops arriving on schedule. And they'll pay the hardest, too. Ranchers like Joe Kipp and Terry Lennis Zink are already living through what happens when the ice disappears. For generations, the Snowpack and Glaciers slowly fed creeks, keeping pastures green and helping ranchers survive the brutal heat of August. Lennis Zink has seen his land turning to dust months earlier than it used to. Without the cold mountain water flowing into the irrigation ditches, the grass just stops growing. And when the grass disappears, everything starts collapsing with it. Joe Kipp has watched watering holes dry up and creeks shrink to almost nothing right when cattle need them most. Ranchers are being pushed into impossible decisions. Either they sell off cattle early, or they spend thousands trucking water onto land that used to provide it for free. This isn't just about ranching. For the Blackfeet Nation, it's about holding onto a way of life that's existed here for generations. So now, they're adapting in real time. They're fighting for their water rights, restoring wetlands, even building beaver mimicry structures to slow runoff and trap water before it vanishes. Because on the Blackfeet Reservation, Glaciers melting ice isn't some far-off climate story. It's already changing who gets to stay on the land. The 26 named glaciers still inside the park are vital, and whether they'll still be there in a few years' time is up for debate. It's a highly subjective topic. But what is clear is that glaciers shrink when summer melting outpaces winter snowfall. A lot of it is in the hands of nature, global warming, and greenhouse emissions rising. You might also think it's important to note that they're the only source of the basin's water, but they never were. The total volume of their meltwater is small compared to seasonal snowpack and groundwater. They release water in the months when nothing else does. That timing job can't be replaced by any project. You can't throw money at this problem. When the timing breaks, everything built around summer water breaks with it. The rivers won't fail at once, they'll fail in the months everyone depends on them the most. July and August, the hottest stretch of the year when fields need water and power demand spikes. And that creates a pressure for solutions. As long as the surge continues, there is still space to act. Time to rebuild storage and adjust expectations. But those choices are slow and expensive, and they keep getting pushed aside by emergencies that feel more immediate. A failed siphon, a damaged dam, a court fight over allocation, another round of repairs. Each one gets handled on its own. None of them connects back to the bigger shift underneath. So the system stays busy, not because it's prepared, but because it's constantly repairing what just broke. And that's the trap. The longer things keep functioning, the more normal they appear. And the more normal they appear, the harder it becomes to justify changing everything. By the time the change is obvious in everyday life, the easy options are already gone. The infrastructure will still be there, the agreements will still be in place, but the conditions they were built for won't be. The story keeps coming back to one core fact. The ice in Glacier National Park isn't just scenery. It has been a part of the West's water system for as long as anyone has been measuring it, as something reliable enough to build everything else on top of. It never was. Federal agencies planned around it. So did water offices, treaty negotiators, lenders, utilities, and city managers. Now, it's becoming clear that the ice isn't just shrinking. It's that so much of what was built downstream was relying on it without acknowledging it. Now the system is hitting the limit, and there's no backup for what was thought to be permanent. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. It really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MapPack.